Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. You know I love digging into complex topics, and today we're going to be tackling a really fascinating one, the future of Islam. We're talking about projected growth, its potential impact on the world, especially Western countries. You guys have sent in some really interesting research, and some of these projections are pretty amazing. For example, did you know that by 2050, there could be almost as many Muslims as Christians worldwide? I mean, that's a huge shift. So today we're going to try to understand why this is happening and what it all means. And to help us break it all down, we have our expert on demographics and religious dynamics joining us. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
It's great to be here. I'm excited to dig into this topic. It's one that's really close to my area of expertise.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The research from the Pew Research Center, it suggests that between 2015 and 2060, the Muslim population is going to grow more than twice as fast as the world population overall. And by 2060, Muslims are projected to make up like 31.1% of the global population. That's a huge jump from 24.1% in 2015. What's driving this kind of growth?
Well, there are a couple of key factors. One is high fertility rates.
Okay.
On average, Muslim women have 2.9 children. That's higher than the average for non-Muslims. The other big factor is a youthful population.
Right, so more young people means more potential families in the future.
Exactly. And that creates what we call population momentum. Even if fertility rates stabilize, the population will continue to grow for decades, simply because there are so many young people.
So it's like a snowball effect.
Exactly.
It keeps rolling and getting bigger. But I'm curious, is it just birth rates? What about people converting to Islam? Do the sources talk about that at all?
That's a great question. And it's one of the things that makes Islam unique. It's not expected to see many people leaving the faith. So when you factor in conversions, the projections actually suggest that by 2050, the number of Muslims globally could almost equal the number of Christians.
Wow, that's incredible. That would be a really dramatic shift in the global religious landscape. And what about the really long term, say towards the end of the century? What are sources saying about that?
Well, some projections suggest that if current trends hold, Muslims could even surpass Christians in number by the end of the century.
Yeah.
One projection I saw from NPR back in 2015 estimated that Muslims could make up 32% of the global population by 2070.
Okay, so potentially even more than Christians.
Right.
But obviously these are very long-term projections.
Exactly. A lot can change in that time.
Right. It's almost impossible to predict that far out, but it is pretty striking to think about.
It really is. While the global picture is important, I think what's really fascinating is how this growth is going to affect the West. That's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so let's shift our focus to the West then.
Sure. One thing that's driving the spread of Islam in the West, particularly in Europe, is migration.
Right, people moving from one place to another.
Exactly. And there are projections that suggest the Muslim share of Europe's population is going to keep increasing, not just because of natural growth within Muslim communities, but also because of continued migration.
So that means that Western countries are going to see some pretty significant demographic shifts.
Right. And these shifts could have a big impact on the social and cultural and even political landscapes.
It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Absolutely.
It's about real people and real changes in society.
Right. And that's what makes this topic so compelling. It's a complex interplay of factors. Demographics, culture, politics, they all come together.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit more. Let's start looking at some of the specific impacts that this growth might have, especially in the West.
Sounds good to me. Let's dive in. I think one of the first things to consider is how these demographic changes are going to play out in Western countries.
Right, because it's not just about the overall numbers globally.
Exactly. We need to look at how those numbers translate to specific regions and countries.
And the sources definitely highlighted some pretty significant shifts happening in the West.
Absolutely.
Can you give us some concrete examples?
Well, let's take Germany, for instance. One projection suggested that in a high migration scenario, Germany's Muslim population could reach almost 20% by 2050.
Wow, 20%. That's a big jump.
Yeah, it is. And it's important to understand what those different migration scenarios actually mean.
Okay, yeah, break that down for us.
Sure. So a high migration scenario usually assumes certain factors. Things like ongoing conflicts in other parts of the world, or major economic disparities, things that would lead to continued migration flows.
So it's not a guaranteed outcome.
Right. It's just one possible scenario.
But it helps us understand the potential scale of these changes.
Exactly.
Okay, so back to that 20% figure for Germany, what kind of impact could that have on different aspects of society?
Well, think about things like education and healthcare and housing.
Right. Those are all essential services.
Exactly. And with a growing population, you naturally need more resources.
You need more schools and teachers,
Right.
more hospitals and doctors, more housing options.
Exactly. It's not just about accommodating the numbers. It's also about making sure those services can effectively meet the needs of a diverse population.
So it's not just a logistical challenge, it's also about cultural sensitivity and understanding. The sources talked about both the enrichment that diversity can bring,
Yes.
but also the integration challenges that sometimes come up.
It's definitely a balancing act.
Can you expand on that a bit more?
Sure. So, on the one hand, having a growing Muslim presence in Western countries contributes to a more vibrant and diverse cultural landscape.
I mean, more diversity is generally a good thing, right?
I think so. It brings new traditions and perspectives, unique culinary experiences, different forms of art and music.
It's like adding more colors to the tapestry of society.
Exactly. It makes it richer and more interesting.
But I imagine there can also be some friction.
There can be. When you have different cultural or religious groups, there's always the potential for misunderstandings, even prejudice, especially when there's limited interaction between those groups.
So open dialogue and understanding become even more important.
Absolutely.
The sources also mention the emergence of more visible expressions of Islamic culture and religion in public life.
Yes, and this can take many forms. The establishment of mosques and Islamic schools, the wearing of religious attire like hijabs, these become visible markers of a changing society.
And they can evoke a range of responses.
Absolutely.
Some people might welcome these changes,
Yeah.
others might feel apprehensive or even resistant.
It's a complex issue,
Yeah.
and I think it's worth asking ourselves, how would our own communities respond to these kinds of shifts?
That's a good question for everyone listening to think about. And it's not just about societal changes. The political landscape is also influenced by these trends.
Absolutely. In fact, one thing we've observed is a link between growing Muslim communities and the rise of certain political movements.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. We've seen a rise in populist movements, often on the right of the political spectrum, that sometimes incorporate anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric into their platforms.
And just to be clear, we're not endorsing any particular political viewpoint here.
Yeah.
We're just reporting on what the sources have to say about these complex dynamics. But it does seem like these trends can often lead to greater polarization, more division in society.
There's definitely a concern. These issues can be very sensitive, and they can fuel a lot of debate and tension.
Especially around things like national identity and immigration policies,
Yeah.
and even the role of religion in public life.
Exactly.
It's a reminder of how interconnected these issues really are,
They are.
and how demographic shifts can have very real political consequences.
Absolutely.
The sources also touched on the potential for increased tension between religious and secular values.
Yes, that's another important aspect to consider.
As Muslim populations grow, there's a possibility for more debate around the role of religion in society.
Right, especially in countries with strong secular traditions.
I'm thinking about those debates we often see about things like wearing hijabs in schools.
Yes.
Or offering halal food options.
Exactly. Those kinds of issues often become flashpoints in this broader conversation.
It's about finding that balance between individual religious freedom and the principles of a secular society.
It's not always easy.
So we've talked about a lot of the challenges,
We have.
but I do want to shift gears a bit because the sources also highlighted some potential economic benefits
Oh, absolutely.
of these demographic shifts.
There's a flip side to this coin.
It's not all doom and gloom.
Right. One of the key points the sources made is that a growing Muslim population, especially a younger one, could be a real asset for Western countries.
Especially those facing aging populations and labor shortages.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a two birds with one stone situation.
In a way, yes. You have this demographic group that could help address some pressing economic challenges.
They could fill gaps in the workforce,
Right.
boost economic growth, maybe even contribute to new innovations.
Absolutely.
So it's important to recognize that these demographic shifts present both challenges and opportunities.
I completely agree.
But if Western governments want to make the most of this potential, what kind of policy adaptations might be needed?
Well, the sources really emphasize the need for policies that promote the effective integration of Muslim communities.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It's about creating an environment where everyone feels like they belong.
Yeah.
And have the opportunity to contribute to society. regardless of their faith or background.
So equal opportunities in education and employment,
Yes,
addressing discrimination,
absolutely.
fostering social cohesion between different communities, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
It's a pretty tall order.
It is, but I think it's essential. If we want to build a more inclusive and equitable society.
I agree, and I think it's a good reminder for all of us to think about what we can do individually to contribute to that goal. So much to think about. I feel like we've really gone deep on this one, this deep dive into the future of Islam.
We have.
We've covered so much ground, the reasons behind its projected growth, how this could impact Western societies, the challenges and opportunities, even those surprising advantages we talked about.
Yeah, it's been a pretty comprehensive look.
It really has. And for me, one of the big takeaways is that this isn't a simple issue.
Oh, definitely not.
There's no easy answers. There's so many different angles to consider.
Absolutely.
It's about demographics and culture and politics and economics and religion, all these things intertwined.
Right. And like with any big societal change, there are going to be anxieties
Yeah, for sure.
and hopes and challenges and opportunities.
So if we had to sum it all up, what would you say is the most important takeaway from today's deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we're living through a period of really significant global transformation.
A transformation that's going to continue to shape the world for generations to come.
Exactly.
And how we choose to navigate this change, both as individuals and as societies.
Yeah.
That's going to determine what the future looks like.
It's almost like a call to action. It challenges us to think critically, to question our assumptions, to work toward a more inclusive and equitable world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Your insights have been so valuable.
My pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And to our listeners, thank you for being here with us today. We hope this exploration has been as thought-provoking for you as it has been for us.
And as we wrap up, we'd like to leave you with one final question to ponder.
Okay, hit us with it.
Based on everything we've discussed,
Yeah.
how do you think societies can best navigate the opportunities and challenges that come with these changes?
What role can individuals play?
Right.
Communities, governments?
How can we all work together to shape a more inclusive and harmonious future?
It's a big question, but it's one worth thinking about, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections with us on social media or through our website. We're always eager to continue the conversation.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, keep exploring.
And remember, knowledge is power, but understanding is wisdom.